Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. Shobhankita Reddy, a research analyst with the High-Tech Geopolitics program at Takshashila, and Sai Rahul Poruri, who is the CEO of the FOSS United Foundation, sit down in this episode to unpack the true meaning of tech sovereignty and the role that the open source ecosystem plays in all of this. They discuss government procurement of tech and where open source technologies can help secure a nation's long-term technological resilience. This episode is an extract of a conversation which was held as part of Takshashila's academic conference, which was held in June 2026. Applications are now open for the next cohort of the graduate certificate in public policy. Join us and participate in the next iteration of the academic conference and engage in similar conversations.
Let me get started. So this is the context for this conversation. I think tech sovereignty is a term that's been thrown around quite a bit, and it's almost an amphibious term in the sense that no one seems to understand what it really means, but we throw it around quite a bit anyway. And in the last 2 years specifically, you hear quite a lot about sovereignty when it applies to technology. And in the context of specific technologies, again, we hear it, right? You hear about AI sovereignty and what it means for India, what India and EU might be doing vis-a-vis tech sovereignty. And somehow in the midst of all of this puzzle, open source and open tech broadly comes into the picture. So I wanted to take the time out to understand and unpack what this might mean. And broadly, I think the context for this conversation is that we are in a time where technology is increasingly securitized. I think that's number one, right? We have had about 3 decades of globalization with free flows of capital, talent, knowledge, tech transfers that were quite generous. And we saw the rise of China, as it were, in those last 3 decades. And we saw what that meant overall, in the sense that since China, according to the WTO, what that meant for China's own science and tech ecosystem, we saw the rise of China from being not just a producer of mass market, cheap, reverse engineered products, but also really technology in the sense that high-tech technology, right? We're talking about nuclear fusion, quantum tech, we're talking about artificial intelligence, so on and so forth. So we see a time where technology is increasingly controlled. So what started around 2017, 2018, first with maybe ZTE, then Huawei, these were specific controls that the US government laid on one particular company that was Chinese owned. And we saw how that then became this almost a whack-a-mole approach with multiple technologies coming under the ambit of export controls. And now we have a time where China is kind of doing the same to the US, pretty much the same playbook that the US followed back onto the rest of the world in some sense, right? Particularly in the sectors like critical minerals and rare earths with export restrictions that China does. So in this context of securitized technology and access to technology not being as easy as it was previously, we talk about tech sovereignty. So before I unpack different ways in which you can think about tech sovereignty, I want to call in Rahul and request him to talk about what tech sovereignty is not. Because when you think about the debate between Aratai and Zoho, or when you think about the likes of Twitter versus Coup, the idea of tech sovereignty kind of gets thrown around. But we want to first start around with, hey, that's not tech sovereignty. At least that's not how we want to define tech sovereignty. So maybe first we set that context with what tech sovereignty is not and what gets occupied in the public discourse. And that may actually be a little tangential to the actual conversation.
Yeah, no, perfect, Shobhankita. I think the WhatsApp versus Aratai conversations, and then before that, the Twitter and Coup conversations definitely kept a lot of people. Maybe it introduced tech sovereignty to a lot of people for the very first time, but it definitely isn't what tech sovereignty fundamentally is. I think the easiest way to talk about those specific examples is how the options that are being posed in front of you, it's sort of you're being shown 2 options and you're being told these are the only 2 options. But in reality, that is not the situation. In the sense that you're being given two options where like you're still either living in a walled garden that is being operated by like one player versus another walled garden which is being operated by another player, and you're not being given the freedom to be able to like pick and choose and the freedom to be able to move between these ecosystems and the freedom to be able to operate in any of these ecosystems without getting locked into any of these specific ecosystems. That is the like fundamental thing that we're trying to do. It's not a question of is this thing getting created in India? Is this thing being operated by a company in India? Is this being operated by an entity which is registered in India? Therefore, it comes under Indian laws. That all of those things are levers which we can use to try and control and enforce like tax sovereignty of some sorts. But the fundamental like idea is like, is there freedom for individuals, communities, and organizations to choose, and at the end of the day, the nation state as a whole to like choose. That is what the fundamental thing is. All of these things, and I think the general answer is also a lot of the times things are portrayed as look, here are two options that are in front of you, option A or option B, and there's almost always an option C which is not being discussed, which isn't being shared with us, which we are not able to like understand, and in a lot of cases we're not even able to imagine. So the fundamental like conversation and the effort that everyone needs to try and do is like, how can we imagine better, and how can we imagine that option 3, which actually leads to freedom in all like ways and shapes and sorts, which actually enables tax sovereignty for the nation state and like everyone.
Yeah. So you're defining tax sovereignty as freedom and a lack of market concentration. Basically, you need to have freedom to choose, and you don't want as much market concentration as it were. So, for example, the EU, I mean, apparently spends around $260 billion or so, and primarily for IT services and products, and all of these, or the majority of these, are proprietary. And most of these technologies are American. And so, at one sense, there is market concentration in a few companies, and these companies are not yours. It could be concentrated, again, in the superpowers, as it were, between US and China broadly. And so it can also perhaps be framed as a strategic vulnerability for a nation. So depending on who you talk to, it can be freedom, it can be market concentration, and it can be what it means for strategic autonomy as a nation state to have options to stand. And in that sense, I think I want to introduce different ways of thinking about tax sovereignty. Because firstly, it's maybe like power, in the sense that there is a range, there is a spectrum, and it's not like a yes or no, in the sense that tax sovereignty is not something you either have or don't. It's maybe a range. And for different technologies, for different capabilities, it's a spectrum. And so it's not a yes or no, but it's in some range. So let's look at 4 specific approaches to technology sovereignty as literature might have defined it. So the first is a very maximalist approach, right? Either you have it or not. Either you have it or not. And in that sense, it's maybe very similar to things that are physical in nature, right? Like land. You don't have partial control over your borders. You don't have some control over your borders. Either you have it or you don't. It's almost a binary in that sense, right? So that maximalist approach to tax sovereignty would require maximum control over technologies that you need in your nation state. And this sort of maximalist approach comes with its own problems, because most technologies today have supply chains that are global. Like think about a semiconductor chip, right? Between Taiwan, South Korea, China, the US, and even India, where much of the assembly and testing of these chips happen. It's a supply chain that's obviously complex and interdependent on multiple nations. And so it's perhaps not something you can define as either you have or you don't. And so maybe more meaningful approaches to defining tax sovereignty might be what you just hinted at, which is about freedom, which is about resilience, which is about capability. And in that sense, also, you can define it in multiple ways, right? So across this entire supply chain, do you have some basic capability? And because we are talking in the context of geopolitics, where we have a world that can restrict control of certain technologies that may be absolutely necessary from an economic growth perspective as well. So this is not just a strategic lens. This is practical. If you don't have access to AI today, then the kind of leapfrogs that you want your nation and population to have just get cut off from you. And so what does this mean for just economic growth and not just strategic lens, right? So basic capability across the value chain, so that tomorrow, if someone were to cut off your access, you still are not, pushed to the shove. You have some capability to stand up on your own, and you have some leverage and some say. So that's one. The other may be to say, hey, listen, China doesn't necessarily have all the mines that are in the critical mineral sector within their borders. They're actually a net importer of critical raw materials, but they do much of the processing within their borders. And so you don't have control over the entire supply chain, but you have a spike in one part of the supply chain. So in critical minerals, for example, China might have control over the processing part of the value chain. Taiwan, for example, continues to import semiconductor manufacturing equipment and raw materials, but what they do really well is one part of the entire value chain. And that means that asymmetric capability for that particular sector, for this particular country, means that it's good, even though it doesn't control the entire supply chain. And the other way to maybe think about tech sovereignty, perhaps, is about just general R&D policy, right? And this is a long-term game, because it's a whack-a-mole approach. Today it's AI, tomorrow, who knows, it might be nuclear fusion, day after tomorrow it might be quantum. So as and when capabilities and advancements in a particular technology spring up in different parts of the world, you are then left thinking about why you don't have that technology. And so maybe the best way to think about tech sovereignty over the long term is actually about capability over the long term. And that capability over the long term, the basic capability or asymmetric capability, however you want your approach to be, it cannot happen unless you have some semblance of R&D and innovation ecosystem, and fostering that may be the long-term way to go. Although it's a long-term game, it might not help you today with export controls that US or China might impinge on you, but it's the way to go long term. So it's about resilience, it's about capability, it's about market concentration, it's about freedom. Do you want anything to add to this?
No, I just want to expand on everything that you said, with a couple of examples, across that entire spectrum, right? So there's the maximalist approach that you discussed, and that maximalist approach sort of perfectly clashes with also the imagination of India as the software exporter to the entire world. So we on the one hand can't say that we are going to not import any software whatsoever, and at the same time on the other side say, hey, look, everyone else imports software from us. Those two things don't make sense. At some point or the other, someone else is going to say, look, if you're not importing anything from us, why exactly are we then importing everything from you, and why are we relying on you fundamentally? So if we want to continue with this idea of, oh, look, India is the software exporter, powerhouse, we are where all the GCCs exist, etc., it doesn't make sense in that sense.
Yeah. Also, I recently learned a trivia that India, specifically with software and IT services exports, it exports more than Saudi Arabia's oil exports. So in some sense, it's a massive number, right? And yeah, I mean, it's not practical also to think completely about doing this within your own borders. Even if you tried, you could define it that way. You can define Atmanirbhar to be completely self-sufficient. But some semblance of self-sufficiency needs to come from partnerships and diplomatic engagements. And I think that's a reality that we see even in conversations in the public discourse right now. And the other bit about tech sovereignty broadly, but also about the world we live in today, is that there is complex interdependence. And so there is dependence. And so even as much as the US may be trying to have all of these export controls on China, there's also all of this talk about Chinese firms distilling from US models. So in some sense, even if you have these legal export controls, leakage of technology is going to keep happening. I mean, it's kind of inevitable. It's almost taken for granted. And so in this complex interdependent world, then what do you do, right? And I think one way, and specifically important for India, because we have a tech ecosystem and an R&D innovation ecosystem, which is very nascent in the sense that very little of our broader corporate profit margins, etc., get reinvested into R&D. And I think some of those numbers there as a percentage of GDP are quite sobering. So we need to think about, yes, over the long term, we need to do more in terms of increasing that share of the pie, reinvesting in R&D, and that is going to take decades. And, that's not a shortcut we can ever avoid. But today, what can we do? And I think in that sense, open source broadly comes in as a perfect fit. And, at Takshashila, we've been talking about open source, not just as a way to have your talent improved, It's not just about having these beautiful interoperable standards, but it's actually a necessity from a strategic lens. And so it's not just a good to have, but it's actually a must. And I think some of those conversations we saw quite a bit even in the AI Impact Summit recently. So we see these conversations quite a bit. So firstly, let's start with what broadly is open tech.
I wanted to add like a couple of more things on other parts of the spectrum, like before we go for this. Is that okay?
Yes, please go on.
Yeah, perfect. Just like two more points, like on other parts of the spectrum, where it's not, hey, look, it's full tech self-sufficiency or it's full tech reliance. In between in that spectrum, right, there's some amount of assumption of, okay, fine, like we're going to have some amount of like vendor lock-in and we're going to have some amount of reliance on like external service providers. For a very long time, in my understanding, this is my understanding, I don't have like references to like back this up. I think the ecosystem as a whole has not developed the economic modeling to be able to model opportunity cost and to be able to model vendor lock-in costs. And this is something that all of a sudden everyone is getting a pinch of. And all of a sudden everyone is realizing that, hey, I do not know what the opportunity costs are if all of a sudden tomorrow I lose access to my entire software stack or like significant chunk of it. And it's the same thing with if I'm like making certain decisions. So for example, it's a fairly common, it's an everyday task for like a software team to take decisions on option A versus option B. And a lot of the times, people do not have the necessary tools to be able to evaluate what is the economic cost of vendor lock-in. With this specific vendor, with this specific tool, with this specific ecosystem, etc., etc., etc. These are things which I think all of a sudden are becoming like front and center in a lot of the conversations in the middle of the spectrum. And all of a sudden, once this starts becoming more and more obvious, I think this is again like where open source can really, really come and hammer the point by saying that, look, these things become much lower, opportunity costs and vendor lock-in costs become much lower with the open source ecosystem.
Yeah. So maybe a good time to shift gears and talk about open source, as it were, right? So firstly, I mean, open technologies or open source or however you want to call it is not a monolith. There's open software, there's open hardware, there's open standards, there's a whole bunch of things. And I think people are at the core of all of this. So maybe we start with touching on what would you call open source to be? What are the benefits of open source? What does it entail? And vis-a-vis software, hardware, standards, people, what do we see happening? And also, what are the challenges necessarily in each of those?
Yeah, it's been 3 years since, no, more than 3 years. Oh my God, it's been 4 years since I did the Takshashila Tech Policy course. So one of the things I wanted to understand, right when I joined the Takshashila course was to develop some sort of an understanding about how is the free and open source software ecosystem and all the other open technologies which broadly get categorized as a digital commons. How is the digital commons different from the physical commons that everyone interacts with? And how are the physical commons being governed and how well do those techniques and like processes adapt into the digital commons? The reason why I'm saying that at the end of the day is the same way all of us rely on physical commons. Let's say it's like the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the like soil that we rely on. All of us have also come to rely on the digital commons and the digital infrastructure. Right, like we are using WebEx right now. There's a whole bunch of like open source technologies which actually make this like happen, which are able to take the video on your device, split it up into ones and zeros, send it across the internet, and then like get it to the person on the other side, and everyone is able to like look at everything, right? And those shared digital infrastructure that like all of us rely on is at the end of the day what the like open source and the open technology ecosystem is. And the same way, there are a significant number of people who've been trying to maintain the physical commons, not because there is a particular economic reward that comes out of it. Yes, there might be some amount of an economic reward, but it isn't significant. It doesn't. You'd get a lot more if you are extractive of the physical commons, but you don't get as much if you are helping maintain and sustain the physical commons. In very much the same way, there are a significant number of people who, like, because of weird wiring in their brain, is an easy way to put it, have decided that, hey, look, we are going to spend time maintaining the digital common, maintaining the digital infrastructure that all of us rely on. There's a whole bunch of like different sets of incentives involved here. There's some amount of like shared appreciation for the fact that, hey, look, all of like this large group of people across the entire world are helping like keeping this digital infrastructure going that the entire world is like come to rely on. There's also like a few financial incentives like here and there in terms of like when you build a shared digital infrastructure that everyone relies on, all of a sudden your expertise is public, the thing itself like has economic value, and then maybe you are able to derive some amount of like that economic value for yourself. So that broadly is how like I would like people to look at open like so software, open technologies in general, and the broader digital commons.
Yeah, and right when you talk about sustenance or what you broadly hinted at as the consumption versus contribution problem, I think that's a big one, right? In the sense that it's a free for all and it's easy to consume, but the number of people who consume might not be the same number of people who want to contribute back into these technologies. And so it becomes the scenario where a few people end up almost being burdened to publicly maintain some of these things that a multitude of other people use. So there's this famous XKDR cartoon about digital infrastructure, and much of it is dependent on this little bit, which is being maintained almost thanklessly by some developers sitting in some corner of the world, right? So, and India has this problem quite a bit because the numbers that you will see on the internet is about just the massive number of developers and AI engineers and however you define these roles that, for example, India has on, say, GitHub and so on. But the problem is that not many of them are actually actively contributing. Many of them are actually only consuming. So the same problem of innovation and giving back, etc., we see in the open source world vis-a-vis India as well. What are the challenges there? What do you think needs to change for this to change? Because I know some of your work is to actually kind of help change that at FOSS United. So yeah, that's my first question. And also as a trivia on the side, we were on the same GCP PTP cohort. We were actually on the same squad. We were actually brainstorming for the same thing during the workshop. So the same 4 years back ago, I was on the same squad with you. Yeah, but sorry, back to the conversation.
Yeah. No. I need to go and bother Satya again the next time that I'm stopping in Delhi. Anyway, yeah. So let me talk about like sustainability also from the lens of tech sovereignty. So there's this like relatively recent discovery for me, but I'm guessing this is a shared mental model for most people at Takshashila. This idea of everything is downstream from culture. Like the culture that all of us like exist within, and the tech ecosystem specifically exists within, that ends up like having first order, second order, third order effects in terms of like what happens in smaller factions of the tech ecosystem. And the open source software ecosystem is definitely a smaller subset of the broader Indian tech ecosystem, right? And like since the very beginning, in my understanding, the Indian tech ecosystem has very much been focused on let me build solutions for you and solve your problem by putting together like other things. And then let me also hold on to the intellectual property of all of these other things that I'm building, the internal building blocks that I'm building, so that I'm able to like keep building more and more things as and when like somebody else comes in and like asks me for a solution. This is like very much in stark contrast with a lot of like maybe the product mindset that exists in a lot of other like, places, right? And there's definitely a product mindset like, that is coming out in India as well, but it does feel like the product mindset that exists in India is still sort of an extension of the services mindset versus a very first principles, what does the product need to be? What is the economic mode that this sort of a product have? What is the business mode that this product have, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason why I'm going down there is because when the individual developers are in this tech ecosystem, where the primary incentive is how quickly can you put together blocks to build a final solution, get it to like a production worthy state, and then move on to the next project, and then you move on to the next project. Right. This sort of an incentive structure effectively means that our engineers are not as incentivized to let me dig really deep to evaluate the technology choices, to think about vendor lock-in and to think about opportunity costs. I'm incentivized very clearly to put things together and then like ship it across. And I'll worry about opportunity costs and vendor lock-ins at some point in the future. And like even if those problems do appear in the future, because I've built this solution for like someone on a third party, they have a vendor lock-in on me. So I can still like charge them whatever it is that I want, build a new thing for them, like make whatever changes for them, and then like give it back to them. My personal opinion right now is that like this sort of a culture that we live in effectively ends up meaning that there aren't as many people who actively think about what are these building blocks and how deep can I go to understand the various different layers that exist here. Right? Most people dig like one layer into the software stack, maybe two layers into the software stack. Most people live within the Lego blocks that are built in their organization, maybe one layer down, which are the open source like projects, on top of which their internal Lego blocks are built. Right? Very few people like go deeper than that, and very few people have the financial incentive either within their organization to say that, hey, look, let me go down and fix some of those problems in the open source ecosystem. Right? And it feels very similar with a lot of the products that have like come out of here as well. There are a few very exceptional examples in India, and it's not like there aren't. There are a few exceptional examples of like organizations which have said, I know very clearly what my business moat is. All of these software packages that I've built internally, it doesn't make sense for me to hold on to this intellectual property. Let me open source it so that other people are able to make use of it and then like take this further. But unfortunately, that isn't what the broader culture is. And that, I'm afraid, is the reason why there is such a big like sustainability problem and also a tech sovereignty problem. Because again, like we are not incentivized to think about what are the vendor lock-ins here. We're not incentivized to think about what are the opportunity costs here. We're not incentivized to think about how are we building systems to prevent other people from getting locked in with us, and how are we ensuring that we're pushing the open source, open standards, and like open technologies further, so that again, like we're pushing the tech ecosystem as a whole further.
So, because we're talking about what the state can do top down, I think one actually is procurement. For example, the EU is big on procuring open source products for their internal use, especially within the government, right? And I think FOSS United and multiple others have spoken about public money, public code, that if you're using taxpayer money for procuring software systems, then it needs to be transparent, and it can't be the higher markups that many of these proprietary softwares have. You must be frugal in your approach, and it must also be, public code, public money. Can you maybe throw light on this? Can you talk about what that would entail and what that means and what the challenges there are from your own experiences?
Yeah. So just to like set the ground again, one of the first things and one of the fundamental things that I learned from the tech policy course is the fact that there is no such thing as good policy, bad implementation. If the implementation is bad, then the policy itself was bad, because the policy should take into consideration the capacity of the state to implement that policy. The reason why I'm saying this is because, again, I was going to say, India has good policies and bad implementation. So India has policies from like 2014, 2015, and 2016, which specifically say that one, wherever possible, when the government is procuring software, it has to give equal priority to an open source alternative, if the open source alternative is just as capable as a closed source software, as a proprietary software. Right? So that is point number one. And like if you simply look at how costly the solution is going to be, if the functionality itself were on equal terms, the proprietary software would of course cost more for you to write, because you have to write and maintain the entire thing. Versus if you're using an open source solution, you take something existing from the open source ecosystem, you adapt it into the specific like need of that organization or the department, and you're done. So therefore, the tender would also like come in at a much lower rate. And then a couple of years down the line, the government then put out another policy that says that anytime the government actually creates software, either by itself, let's say by the NIC or the DIC or one of the other government departments which have tech capacity, or if the government actually procures and gets a third party a vendor to create software for it, the government can open source it. The government can say that, look, this is my IP, I paid you to build it. I'm going to own the IP for this, and I'm also going to open source this. Right? Because, for example, imagine the kinds of things that a government needs, right? An NIC or a DIC is responsible for maintaining, let's say, websites for districts or panchayats or like towns or these sorts of things. it's more or less a content management system. It can be the exact same content management system across all of these, with just the content itself being different, right? It's just a question of, okay, a Prakasam district in Andhra is going to have different content versus another district in Bihar or another district in Telangana. But the underlying architecture of all of that should be the same. Why do I need to create software entirely from scratch for one district and then do the same thing for another district and another district and another district? Right? The fundamental architecture here can be the exact same. All of these can just basically use the same open source code and then customize it to the specific content that they need. This sort of an idea exists across the board. Imagine all the union-funded or state-funded educational colleges. All of them need some sort of a HR system internally, some sort of a ERP system internally, some sort of a learning management system, etc., etc., etc. All of these, the only thing that is different is the fact that you need to be able to put in different people into the system. But at the end of the day, the software should be the same. So it's an absolute waste of taxpayer funds. If each of these individual institutions is paying from scratch to get some of these things built out and get some of these things maintained, it's a waste of taxpayer funds if instead of relying on an open source alternative, you are paying for a closed source version, which also effectively means that you're always stuck with that vendor. And if at some point you had to move away from that vendor because that vendor disappeared into thin air, the company ceased to exist, you now have a significant cost of moving away from that old system into a new system. I'll give one more example. Hopefully everyone in this room has been to a railway at some point or the other, railway station at some point or the other. There are these huge LED boards nowadays on railway stations, right? There's a software system that hooks up to those LED boards to be able to display the necessary information. And it goes back to a computer that is sitting somewhere in the railway station to be able to feed information into those boards, right? When the Indian Railways was deciding on getting these things implemented, and this isn't me theoretically saying things, this is first-hand information from people who work at the Indian Railways, which I got to know about. They specifically said that they had picked a couple of vendors in some pockets of the country who were using their proprietary systems. So the hardware was proprietary, the software that they were using was proprietary, and even the messaging protocols between the, let's say, computer which is running that software and this hardware that is showing this information was also proprietary. So at the end of the day, it so happened that after a couple of years, that company became insolvent and they weren't able to provide these services anymore. And all of a sudden, you have dead hardware sitting on both sides. And there's no one that you could even pay to be able to say, look, try and reverse engineer some of these things and continue this hardware, keep this hardware going and keep that hardware going, right? You have to scrap the entire thing. Huge waste of taxpayer funds, and you have to start all over again. So this, at the end of the day, is the reason why we need to think about public money, public code. We need to think about open standards, and we need to think about open source software and preventing vendor lock-in, especially when software and software systems are being deployed by the state at the union level or at the state level. And the fundamental problem that exists when trying to make this work and trying to make this reality is the fact that the vendor ecosystem for government projects is deeply, deeply entrenched. We've, again, firsthand heard from a number of different people who either are within the government who make and get the tenders written, or are consultants who help governments write the tenders, or in some cases are vendors who are submitting for tenders. And it is fairly common for the government to write a tender which very clearly puts priority for one specific vendor. The government has written that tender with that vendor in mind already, and they sort of try and tweak the tender so that it's slightly broad enough that maybe a few more people will end up applying, and it isn't looking like you are preferring a certain vendor. At the end of the day, we're now moving from again theoretical policy to actual capacity to enforce this policy. Right? Are the bureaucrats who are writing these tenders, what is the political incentive structure that exists there? And also, even if we are able to get over the political incentives that exist here, what is the tech capacity that they have in the first place? Do these people know what all alternatives even exist to be able to try and highlight them in the tenders and then try and receive relevant tenders from people who are providing open source services? So those are some of the like roadblocks that exist when it comes to actually bringing this to life. Again, good theoretical policies. We do not have the capacity, the state capacity to enforce them and make them come to life. And some of the ways that like we can turn this around is by providing support to the bureaucrats at a very local level. By working with bureaucrats locally in like smaller districts and smaller states, and then being able to tell them that, look, when you're trying to put a tender out, we would like to help you out. We would like to add comments on broadening that tender. And again, one other comment when it comes to software procurement is, can we reduce the requirements of a vendor in the sense of why does it need to be 1,000 people company with hundreds of crores of turnover to provide some small little solution for a learning management system in some district for their schools? Are we able to reduce that so that there are like more local players, maybe like startups, maybe people who are like running these sort of boutique open source services firms who will be able to apply for those tenders versus again the existing entrenched vendor ecosystem who caters to government functions? I'm sorry, that was a very, very long.
No, very helpful. So I think procurement is one, and we have covered that. And the other is it doesn't have to be just in this so-called boring tech that is the foundation of our digital life, right? Even in high-tech sectors like AI, we see how the only leverage perhaps that we have is actually to go open source. Because we have about 5 or 8 companies globally that lead in generative AI and that pretty much have market concentration. The best of innovations coming out in this technology right now are between these companies, and they are obviously. There are complexities because some of this could be. Like the US law can actually determine whether or not you have access to this. Generally, for example, right now, at least for use cases in the military, it's heavily regulated, right? I mean, you can't have access to Anthropic and its technologies and its products unless it's certified and sort of agreed upon by the US government. And maybe if you're in the allied partner network, that will go through, and maybe it's also in Anthropic's interest to sell to more governments. And so maybe business sense will prevail. But this risk that this actually has implications strategically, and it's very real because almost the character of war is changing, and we might be left behind unless we have some capability here. And maybe the only way to get some of this capability is open source, right? So it's not just in this so-called boring software that we all need to depend on and we need to save cost on. It's actually very real because the monopoly that NVIDIA's CUDA has essentially means that that's very hard to chip away for a new entrant or another player, et cetera, et cetera. So just in the interest of time, I wanted to talk about 2 things. One is about open standards.
Sorry, 1 second. I want to add a small point there, Shobha. That's absolutely like critical. So there's a little bit of chronology which I want to like talk about. So the NumPy and SciPy packages came out like mid 2010s, maybe late 2000s, and then like I was lucky enough to work at the company where a lot of the code for NumPy and SciPy was like written. And these packages became robust. These packages like got to version 1.0 and more. And because those packages became robust and they got standardized, the rest of the Python ecosystem was able to build on top of that to be able to build packages that are able to model neural networks. And all of a sudden you had scikit-learn. And then on top of that, like people said, hey, look, we are able to build much more like performance stuff like TensorFlow and PyTorch and a whole host of other like machine learning packages that we can listed. When we're talking about innovation, we're talking about like high tech, right? It's again like very underappreciated that if you have a robust open source ecosystem, it has higher order like derivative effects of this sort, where because the technology has all of a sudden reduced the barrier to building a neural network, building a machine learning model, training a deep learning, and so on and so forth, you are able to progress much, much faster. in some ways, we are able to split our capacity into, hey, look, there'll be a bunch of us who are going to focus on ensuring that the underlying digital infrastructure is incredibly robust and the open source that supports it is like absolutely like top notch. And look, you know what, the people who want to build vehicles which go on this infrastructure, which run on this infrastructure, why don't you people focus on, yeah, fine, you know what, build on top of these abstractions and makes your life much, much more easier instead of you having to write the entirety of the code by yourself. This is again often underappreciated. And again, like when you're talking about how quickly are we able to like leapfrog and work on some of these deeply technical problems, building that sort of a solid open source foundation is what will enable us to unlock those sorts of, this was never possible until now that the open source ecosystem for these things exists, that the capacity exists and the abstractions exist.
Yeah. Actually, let's go on one more tangent. I want you to talk about this popularly held myth, I think is how you would put it, which is that open source is not safe. And so if it's about security and safety, if it's about mission critical applications, or maybe not even mission critical, but if obviously everyone cares about just being cyber resilient. So if it's about that, then open source and security/safety are not necessarily the most compatible. Do you want to not take too long, but just touch upon this a little bit?
The right way of thinking about digital security is your surface area and not what exists inside of it. The security of India is determined by the physical borders and not what is inside of it. Like, I don't need to put barbed wires around every single city. I don't need to have military installations and military presence in every single city all across the country. Right? I don't do that because I know that, hey, look, my periphery is where security is important for me. That is where a possibility of a threat exists. That is where the threat vector comes in from. That is where like penetration can happen. And that is where I need to ensure that I have the best visibility and I have the like, tightest amount of control. It's the exact same thing with software. It does not matter whether you're using open source or closed source inside of the software periphery, right? Inside of the surface area of attack. So why does it matter whether there's open source software or closed source software inside of it? And in fact, there again, it doesn't matter whether you perceive open source as safe or as not safe. At the end of the day, what matters is have you locked down the periphery in a sufficient manner? The surface area, has that been like evaluated and controlled in a sufficient manner that you do not have to worry about what is on the inside, right? And again, a lot of the times when people bring up these conversations about, oh, open source is not safe, that is because you're focused on what is on the inside and not on the periphery. That is because you do not have the right mental model to be able to focus on the periphery. You don't have the processes and frameworks and structures in place to be able to ensure that the surface area is well like, defended. And therefore, any security vulnerabilities that exist inside of the system do not matter. They do not get exposed to the surface. That is fundamentally more important, like whether or not you trust like open source to be safe or like not to be safe. Then we can go into additional conversations about, look, at the end of the day, if you're relying on a closed source software, you're blindly trusting them when they tell you that there are no security vulnerabilities. Right? Only recently have government regulations, both in the West and in India, gotten serious enough that companies have to report vulnerabilities, have to report data breaches, and so on and so forth. And I suspect the amount of reporting that happens voluntarily from companies is still not the actual amount of data breaches that happen in India. So, like, there's again like this adage of like, do you blindly trust or do you trust and verify? And only with open source software are you able to trust and verify. Right? You can't. You are not able to verify if it's a closed source like service provider. The best that you'll be able to do is a company can say, hey, look, we are closed source, but we have gone to this independent third party. Those people we have given access to our source code. They have evaluated us and then they've given us a certain rating. So like you either are able to do it yourself, trust and verify, or like you trust them and then maybe rely on some third party's verification that their system is safe.
Last question before we open it up. I think there's a bunch of interesting questions we should get to about open standards, because the promise of open source is actually the lack of vendor lock-in and the fact that it doesn't matter where it comes from. It can originate somewhere else, but as long as it's open source, because it's interoperable, and so you need to have a plug-and-play system that works. So how do we go about thinking about these standards, setting these standards? Because obviously, there is lobbying for some of these standards, right? And so that's a reality of the world that we live in, and power wields in interesting ways. And so it's actually the Chinese presence in most of these international standard organizations that seem to have a way. The success and conversion, we're not, the data is a little muddy, but definitely there's a concerted effort to influence standards, even in technologies that may still be nascent, like quantum at this point, right? So how do we go about thinking about open standards and generally the idea of global interoperability?
So one there again, looking at this from the perspective of tech sovereignty and enabling market competition to be able to achieve that tech sovereignty, what are the market incentives that need to be set up to be able to push companies towards standardization in the first place? So, for example, everyone is like gung-ho on generative AI. Everyone is like agents. And the reason why a lot of these things are able to work is because Anthropic decided that, hey, look, here is something called model context protocol. This is a standard that we have decided. Here is what this looks like. I think they also came up with a version 2 of the standard very recently, sometime in the last 3 months, if I remember correctly. It's not an open standard. It's not an open standard in the sense of there is no existing standards body which is recognized that yes, this version of the model context protocol is what we are acknowledging as an open standard that everyone has agreed upon, etc., etc. But it has become the de facto standard that everyone has agreed upon. And it's again very interesting because there's very little study and understanding of the kind of soft power an organization or a state gets if you are where that standard has originated. Right? There's a certain amount of soft power that Anthropic wields in the generative AI space because they are the ones who came up with the MCP protocol, MCP standard, and they are the ones who are pushing for it and who are trying to get it adopted and who are trying to evolve that standard so that it's much more broadly applicable to everyone. The same thing across a whole bunch of other situations. If we're going to talk about I don't know how many people here, I'm reasonably sure there are people here split between Android and iOS. There's that green bubble, blue bubble situation, right? On an iOS, if you're texting someone on Android versus texting someone on iOS. Those things are more or less going away because Google lobbied hard to get a new standard put in place called RCS, which is an evolution of the SMS standard. Right? SMS is simple messaging. RCS is rich communication standard. And RCS has all of the support for, okay, so I can send pictures, I can send reactions, I can send emojis, whatever. Right? And there again, there was a very clear market incentive for Google to push for a new standard and for Google to push for the adoption of that open standard, for to get it recognized as an open standard and to get it adopted by a large number of players. And eventually now, finally, Apple has said, yeah, okay, fine, I'll support the RCS protocol in iMessage. And some of these green bubble, blue bubble conversations have gone away. It's necessary for market competition to exist in the first place and market incentives to be set up in such a way that companies are going to try and compete for the market share for users on their platform. And when they're trying to compete for users on the platform, that is when they're going to push for standards. Right? A small startup, if they're able to compete on equal grounds, can come up with an open standard, and then the government can push the larger intense player to say, you are going to accept this standard. You're going to acknowledge that this standard is what is going to be used, and you're going to enable it, etc., etc., etc. For example, the EU, through a policy push, decided that Facebook messaging and Instagram messaging, or all of Meta's messaging services, have to adhere to the XMPP standard, which is a messaging standard. And Meta said, yeah, okay, fine, you are making me do it. I will accept this. And now that standard is implemented, that means that people who are on Facebook Messenger can talk to people who are on other messaging platforms. And people who are on other messaging platforms can text with people in Instagram. But the interesting thing there again is the software already exists, the standard already exists, the policy is only enforced in the EU. And even though it's more or less the same software that Meta runs on Europe and in India, because India does not have that policy, we are stuck in this situation where if I am on WhatsApp, I cannot talk to someone who, let's say, is on another XMPP application, and someone who's on another XMPP application will not be able to talk to me on Facebook Messenger, even though software already exists. So there again, it's a question of how well are we, is the competition regulator, able to push for, no, I'm going to ensure that there is an incentive to create an open standard. And once open standards are being created, I will ensure that those open standards are being adhered to by that ecosystem as a whole. Then we start seeing interesting dynamics in terms of, okay, now we are able to build open source software that uses these standards, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was a time thing.
Yeah. No, but just building on that, right? We at Takshashila have written about how there is actually an urgent need, and maybe the lowest hanging fruit when it comes to open technologies could be open standards, in the sense that the India and EU already have a Trade and Technology Council, which is now further bolstered with the FTA announcement. But on the sidelines of some of these diplomatic engagements, you must be talking about open standards, standardization. So it must actually feature in your foreign policy as well. And there are now mechanisms and technology features in diplomatic engagements quite high anyway, and open standards might be a good starting point that doesn't require too much of either of the two players. Now on to the questions.
One last thing, because I should have mentioned this right at the very beginning. A few months back, the state political class made a big deal about, hey, look, we are moving away from NIC-supported email to Zoho. I think the process is still playing out where more or less the entire union staff, the central government staff are being moved away. The email platform that they're using is being moved away from something that NIC built and maintained to something that Zoho has created. It's the Zoho email platform, which with the branding, NIC branding on top of it. Setting aside conversations about public money, public code, or any of those sorts of things, because the NIC system that was in place was built on an open source software, and it was working perfectly fine. In fact, as late as 2017 or 2018, very high officials in the government department waxed a lot of praise about, oh no, this system is great, etc., etc. The reason why this transition could happen in the first place is because of open standards. There are email standards that have existed for a very, very long time, which mean doesn't matter if I'm using an NIC system or a Zoho system or a Gmail or a whatever, I'm able to take my entire inbox and move it to something else, and I'm able to seamlessly interoperate between any email service provider and any email client. This is what is fundamentally frustrating when we are having conversations about tech sovereignty. It's not a question of, am I able to move from one walled garden to another? It's a question of, do I have the freedom to be able to move to anything else? So can a state department now set up their own email server, and can that work seamlessly with this Zoho provider service? Theoretically, it should. Technologically, it should. But what sort of problems will this pop up again, in the political capital sense, in the sense of these technical systems might not work seamlessly together, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah. Ashwin Subramanian has a question, and this is about government, state, or central. Are there any instances of AI being successfully implemented? I would actually ask Ashwin to think more broadly about this, right? For example, why is DigiYatra not AI implementation by the government? It is computer vision, and it is implemented at the scale that it has been. And I think we must. And there are so many experiments at this point in time, early stage, that we are aware of happening in DPI plus AI, in the sense that DPI has already been rolled out. There's the foundation of it being Aadhaar. Can we then have artificial intelligence for multiple other use cases that may be application specific? So, for example, just about language translation and being able to reach multiple audiences beyond common languages, right? Things like that. So there's a lot that is going on in implementation of AI, but much of this might be early stage. DigiYatra, I think, is perhaps the most scaled application that comes immediately to mind.
Thank you all for listening in. Once again, if you would like to join the next cohort of the Graduate Certificate in Public Policy program, do apply. The next cohort begins in September and will end in December 2026. Thank you, and see you in the next one.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.